So, welcome to Oneshul. My name is Patrick Olive. I'm the executive director of Oneshul. We are the world's only online independent minyan. Another word you could use would be a havura, a circle of friends. Now, what does that mean? It means that on oneshul.org we have live streaming Shabbat services, we have classes, holiday events, we have other kinds of prayer services, and it all revolves around lay people and around volunteers. So we always have great events going on and exciting ways to get involved. Everything we do at Oneshul is free. However, we suggest a $5 donation if you appreciate a class. So if there's a class or a prayer service that you attend, please donate $5. That's the cost of a venti frappuccino at Starbucks. You probably don't need to be drinking it anyway, and you can probably afford it. So all you have to do is click on the donate button. Now, I had someone email me the other day and say, well, I feel bad about giving $5. That just doesn't seem like that much. I should really wait until I can give 18 or 36 or 100. No. Don't wait. Do it now. Because often what happens is that we have good intentions and we believe that we're going to do good things, and we end up kind of forgetting about it, or sometimes life kind of gets a hold of us and we don't have that opportunity to give. That's why in most Jewish homes you'll have a tzedakah box. What's a tzedakah box? It's a bunch of coins. Doesn't seem like much to give a quarter, right? Same idea. So please do give. We have other opportunities to volunteer, lots of different opportunities with that. All you have to do is send me an email, patrick@punktorah.org. All right. So we're going to start this class with a quote that comes from Chabad.org, but it comes via John F. Kennedy and the first Rebbe of Chabad Hasidism. So here's the quote. Long before John F. Kennedy declared, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," Rabbi Zalman of Lehi, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, said something similar to a self-absorbed disciple seeking blessing. And he said, "Until now, you have focused on what you need from God. It's about time you asked, what is needed of me?" So that's what we're going to, address in this video. We're going to, in this class, we're going to address, what does God want from us? And that seems like such an arrogant thing, right? To think of the master of the universe, the creator of everything, or if you don't like that particular way of understanding God, the force that's within us to do good, or the sort of first start of the Big Bang, or the highest morality that we can achieve. Whatever sort of poetry you want to use to describe this sense of infinity, it seems arrogant from us as, just one creature on this planet to think we know, exactly what this, this thing, this force, whatever you want to use, would think about and would want from us. But the Jewish tradition has ideas about this, and really that's based on the goal of the Jewish people. So the goal of the Jewish people is to sanctify the mundane and to make it sacred. So the mundane means everyday types of things. Eating, sleeping, going to work, going to school, driving your car, things that you sort of do kind of on autopilot. So you have to take those mundane things and make them sacred. And what happens is that we create a relationship where heaven, the sort of celestial abode of God, the realm of godliness, whatever sort of metaphors you want to use, comes to earth. So we're literally taking a piece of heaven and we're putting it on earth. And when we do that, it's reciprocal. So in Judaism, God has mitzvot, God has commandments. These commandments come from this higher energy place down to human beings. Human beings absorb that Torah, those teachings, and then we act out those mitzvahs, we act out those commandments, and what that does is it takes that godly energy and it propels it back up again. So it creates, if you think of recycling almost, it creates this like infinite circle of possibility where heaven and earth are consistently influencing each other. And that's really, what it's about. It's about creating this sort of cyclical type of relationship. Let me know if you have any questions as I'm moving along here. I tend to move sort of quickly, and I want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity. And also, don't be afraid to make comments, even if you don't feel like your comments are good enough or anything like that. There's no such thing as a stupid person. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Everybody matters, and everybody's opinion matters. Remember, this is a Havura. This is, all of us learning together. But that's what that relationship is about. It's about that sort of circle where, godliness and holiness connects with the mundane in our lives, and then we push it back up again and again and again. And so the thing that makes God happiest, if you can think of God as having emotions, the thing that makes God happiest is when we are doing godly things in the best way possible and with the greatest frequency. So an example of what that's like. Imagine you're a parent, and you hear this every now and then, particularly with teenagers. A parent will say, oh, such and such child did something. He's just like his father. Or she's just like her mother. Whatever the case may be. And that can be a positive thing or a negative thing. You can hear your teenager yelling, oh, I hate you. Oh, you're just like your mother. So that's the way it works with God. God's moments of connection with humanity are when God can say, you're just like me. And then it's the flip side as well. So God is able to say, you're just like me, and human beings are able to say, God, I'm just like you. And we're able to create that back and forth in that way. So we're able to take inspiration and then put inspiration back up. And there are lots of areas in Judaism. We think typically in Western religion, as God tells us what to do, we do it, and then that's the end of the cycle. It's all about sort of being the servant, and you're the servant in the sense that you, it's almost like a dictatorship in a certain way. Like God is the dictator in the sky telling you what to do because you're bad and you need to be told what to do. You're not good enough. And, dad or grandpa in the sky is trying to make you be good because you're a bad little kid. And if you are good, then that's it, right? And the idea is that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, and the world is perfectly ordered in that way. Now, we know from experience as human beings that the world isn't that simple, and the relationship with God isn't that simple either. There are times where God influences us, and there are times when we influence God. And all throughout Judaism you see examples of that. You see prophets and patriarchs wrestling with God, getting in arguments with God, human beings sometimes winning over God, God siding with people. There are times when humanity is in the pejorative, when humanity is in the negative, and God is a punishing force. And so that's how that kind of relationship works. It truly is a back and forth. It's not a dictator-servant relationship. It's really more like a marriage. Any questions so far? Anyone having trouble following, or are we ready to move on to the next part of this? And some people call this pantheism. So that's a word you can look up. I'm not going to get into all of that, but pantheism is sort of the philosophical idea of how human beings are able to actually change the nature of the divine and all of that. All right. So we'll move on to the next part. So why would I bring that up in this week's Torah portion? Why would this be worth commenting on? Okay. So in Parsha Shmini, which we had a few weeks ago, there's a story of Aaron. So Aaron is the high priest. Aaron is the brother of Moses. They're out in the wilderness minding their own business, and they have this thing called the Mishkan, or the tabernacle. And that's where they go in and they offer their sacrifices. It's the original synagogue, if you will, and the original temple. And you have this story where Aaron's oldest two sons, their names were Nadav and Avihu, and they go into this tent, and the Bible tells the story in a weird way. It says that they offered something called a foreign fire. Now, part of the sacrificial process back then was burning things. You would burn incense, you'd burn wheat, you would burn, slaughter animals, and then you would burn parts of their bodies as a form of sacrifice. So when it says that they offered a strange fire or a foreign fire, what it's suggesting is that they did something ritualistically incorrect in some way, or sort of strange in some way. And what happens is that God sort of punishes them, well, definitely punishes them for it. They are actually burned alive. God's fire consumes them. And there's a whole sort of story about how Moses and Aaron react to this and some of the things that happen. Now, the Torah says later there's a sort of a phone call between God and Aaron, and God tells Aaron, do not go into the Mishkan intoxicated. And so the rabbis and the people who interpreted the Torah inferred that what happened with Nadav and Avihu, because all of a sudden you have God making this commandment that you're not supposed to get drunk and go into the temple, was that they were drunk and that they kind of made a mess of the place. They didn't offer the sacrifice correctly. They did it in a impolite way, they did it in an improper way, and that was the insult to the divine, that they just sort of came in, sloshed, and whatever, we're just trying to get through the motions, and whatever the case was. And so that's why God had this punishment. Now, there's another way of looking at this, and I gave a devar not too long ago. Actually, it was for that Torah portion a few weeks ago, at a conservative synagogue here in Atlanta, and I talked about this particular midrash. A midrash is a legend. A midrash is not a legend in the sense of making something up. It's basically an inference. So the idea is that, the Bible doesn't always tell us everything all the time about every story. There's little sort of gaps in there. And what the Midrash does is it takes the Jewish texts on whole, and it looks at them, and it tries to see if there are clues in other parts of the Jewish canon, in the Talmud and in the Torah, and in the other books, Nevi'im and Ketuvim. So those are the three parts. Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim are the three sort of chunks, the three volumes that make up the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians would call the Old Testament. We just divide it a little bit differently. Scholars and sages looked at all of these different parts of the Holy Scriptures and tried to find little clues somewhere to try and figure out, well, we're not told the whole story in this section. Maybe there's something somewhere else that can help us to understand this a little bit better. So then, from there, you have midrash. You have legends that are created based on the gaps of information that we are filling up. So there's a midrash based on 1 Kings, the first book of Kings. There's the prophet Eliyahu, and Eliyahu is sort of like the Jewish Santa Claus. He comes to your home on Passover, and there's a whole portion of the Seder, the service that you do at home, the Passover Seder, where you open the door for Eliyahu, and Eliyahu's supposed to come in, and you leave a chair for him. Eliyahu's anglicized name is Elijah. So Elisheva makes an interesting point here. I look at the Midrash as filling in the scenes where the text has faded to black. One could call it the first fan fiction. So that's absolutely true. And interestingly enough, that you would talk about fan fiction, quick side note, we actually have, and it will go up tomorrow afternoon, we have a series of midrashim, of legends, their interpretations of the weekly Torah portion, that are in the steampunk genre. So it's called Steampunk Torah, and this woman named Rivka Raven writes the steampunk series. And she has each Torah portion, and she has them as a story series based in this kind of steampunk genre. So her latest Torah portions will be going up tomorrow. So if you're interested in fan fiction, we have some Jewish fan fiction. In any case, let me get back to the story here of Eliyahu. So Eliyahu is in an interesting situation because he is asked by God to provide a strange fire as his sacrifice. So whereas the Torah in this earlier story talks about Nadav and Avihu offering this fire that God did not command, Eliyahu is actually asked to do that. And what happens when he does that is that he is swept up in the chariot of flame. So if you've ever heard of the chariot of fire, that's what that's about. That's where that story comes from. And so there's an interesting midrash that says, okay, wait, this doesn't make sense. Nadav and Avihu offer a foreign fire, they get killed. Eliyahu offers the same sacrifice and the same foreign fire, he gets to go to heaven. What is that about? That doesn't make sense. And since there's a belief in the Abrahamic religions and monotheism that God can't contradict God, you have to try and figure out how to make all that math add up. So there's a midrash, not everyone agrees with it, that Nadav and Avihu weren't killed as a punishment for sin. That actually what happened to them is that they were swept up in the fire, just like the prophet Eliyahu. But that the difference was that the people, and I sort of expand more on this part, this is where it breaks off from tradition, and I sort of get into my own understanding of this. The people during that time would not have understood what they were seeing. They would not have seen that as a holy being swept up in the chariot of fire kind of thing. They would have seen it as a punishment. Because up to this point, all the Hebrews have seen is God's wrath and punishment on people who do bad things to the Hebrews, right? So sort of making this sacrifice that's foreign, that's, sort of dirtying up the temple, that would have been seen as like a sin against all of the Hebrews, right? And so obviously God's punishing Nadav and Avihu. But there are some people who actually read that differently, and they say, well, no, actually, it was that they offered the same fire that Eliyahu did, but that they did it so far ahead of their time that no one around them could understand it and expect it. So the natural response would have been, wow, those guys are sinners, and whatever the case is, and of course they were burning. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Like, we haven't even talked about this week's Torah portion, right? Well, so Acharei Mot, which is what we're focusing on, is after the death. So after the death of who? Nadav and Avihu. So in Acharei Mot, God warns against unauthorized entry into the holy. So in the temple, you had sort of various levels of entry until you got into the Holy of Holies. And that was where the high priest, the Cohen Gadol, so Cohen is priest, Gadol means like large or big or mighty. Cohen Gadol may, but once a year on Yom Kippur, enter that innermost sanctuary and offer the Yom Kippur sacrifice. So this week's Torah portion is all about this kind of idea of offering of sacrifice in this really particular sort of way. So now we'll get into sort of what does it mean to be good enough, right? So Nadav and Avihu, if you take the traditional understanding, weren't good enough. They had broken a rule. They had sort of graffitied the temple through their bad behavior. Or you could say that they were so holy that God had to start instituting laws so that the Hebrews could eventually evolve to a point of being like Nadav and Avihu. So, depending on how you want to look at it. So, what does it mean to be good enough? That'll be the next sort of question here. Are there any questions, comments, concerns before I move on to that? Everyone's being very quiet tonight, and it disturbs me. Could it be that I'm just talking too fast, or that I'm blowing your mind? Lisa says Patrick likes to talk with his hands. I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, well, I guess everyone's just listening, huh? Okay, great. I must be very captivating tonight. All right. So the question is, are you good enough? So I'm going to pose this question. I'm going to force you guys to interact here. Do you believe that you are good enough or holy enough to transform the profane, the day-to-day, into the sacred? Don't look at your notes on this one. I want your honest opinion. Do you think that you are holy enough? Do you think that you understand enough what it means to be holy so that you could do these sorts of things? So Lisa says, sometimes I never feel good enough. That's a good point. Tamara says no. Anne says no, not yet. Okay. Elisheva says, I think I'm good enough to learn more. Okay, great. Elisa says not yet. Yoel says, one day at a time I try to live a life of mitzvot so that I am trying to be holy. Okay. Any other comments? So it looks like the spectrum of holiness is sort of either in the middle of I'm trying to be good all the way to I'm not good enough. We don't quite seem to have that other side of being holy. So we haven't had anyone here who said, well, I'm holy enough. No one's been that bold yet. So now I'm going to make a really radical comment, which is that you are holy enough. So I want everyone to move a shift of consciousness from I'm not good enough or one day I'll be good enough to I'm already good enough and getting better. So let's try and move that consciousness over that way. And here's how we're going to do that. The first thing to think about is, who are the original holy people? Well, the people who offered the sacrifices and were in charge of the temple, which was sort of the holiest job you could have, were the Cohen. So, pop quiz. Why did the Cohen get to be in charge? What made them so wonderful? If you're, let's say you're, John Cohen, and your, father was Cohen, and your grandfather was Cohen, your great-grandfather was a Cohen, and your job as a Cohen is to offer the sacrifices. What makes you qualified to do that job? What kind of job interview process did you have to have in order to be a Cohen? Does anyone know? It's a little bit of a trick question. And like I said, there's no, there's no punishment if you're not, if you don't have the right answer or anything like that. Let's see. Looks like everyone's getting the answer right, actually. It's you were born one. That's all it was. You were born a Cohen. So even today, there are remnants of the original Kohanim. So the last name Cohen is Kohen. You're a descendant of someone named Cohen. Now, in the modern world, it's a little tricky because there are some people who are named Cohen who are not Kohanim. But nonetheless, originally, if your last name was Cohen, you were a Kohen. And there are other remnants of that as well. People with the name Khan or Katz or Katzenberg, these loud cough sounds. Those were people who are descendants of Kohanim. So if you go to an Orthodox synagogue and someone says, "Are you a Kohen?" it's a pretty good chance if your last name is Cohen, you are a Kohen. So that's all it took. So you were born into it. Well, what does that say? You could be born into something and be terrible at it. There's plenty of people who are born into wealthy families who wind up broke. There's plenty of people who are born into families of actors and are terrible actors and end up doing something else. There's people who are raised by, law professors or, doctors or whatever the case is, and they end up becoming, some blue-collar job, right? So just because you're born into a certain kind of family doesn't mean you're going to be particularly good at whatever your family does, right? So it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that a Cohen was a particularly special person. You're a Cohen. That's why you did it. And that's all there is. It's an inherited job. So we can sort of set aside this idea. Now, there's all kinds of, interpretations about why the Kohanim were so great, but ultimately we know how people operate, and just because you come from a holy family doesn't mean you yourself are going to be holy. So immediately, the first group of holy people weren't necessarily good people. So holding yourself up against a Kohen is entirely possible. You are no worse than someone who was born into the Kohanim. A few other examples of some things that should help you to shift your focus to the idea that you are good enough. Let's look at some of our other leaders. So, what does everyone think of Noah? Was Noah a good guy? Does the Torah say anything about Noah being a good guy or anything like that? Why did Noah get to survive the flood of the earth? Anyone know? What was it about Noah that made him worth surviving? Remember, God is killing everything. So it's Noah and his family who get to go aboard the ark with, penguins and lions and, bacteria and all of the other, creatures that are going up on the ark. Why Noah? The Torah actually says something. There's actually a reason why Noah was picked. And while you guys try to figure it out, I'm going to massage my carpal tunnel. So one person says he believed in God. Another person says his faith. And Elisheva wins the prize here. So he was righteous, okay? But he was righteous, the Torah actually says, for his time. So let's pause for a moment and think about what it means to be righteous for your time. The phrase "for your time" is a context. It's a way of understanding what the word righteous is. So it wasn't that Noah was a super great guy, it's just he was the best of the worst. It's kind of like if you went to a buffet, let's say, and there was tons of food laying out, and there was one thing that just tasted amazing, and everything else tasted like garbage. Is it really that one thing tasted amazing? Or was it that just compared to everything else, it tasted really good? That's how the Talmudic sages would actually interpret that it wasn't that Noah was that amazing, but he was the best that God had available. And Yoel makes an interesting comment. Torah had not been given, so we're not, this is the Noah story. This is before Mount Sinai. So he was righteous before Torah. So that's a great way of understanding that. The Talmud says he was basically the best of the worst. Now, you could flip that around and say, well, at least he was the best. And as Yoel is saying, there is no Torah. There is no God-given law at this point as to what behavior is supposed to be. So if he was holy without anything around him to tell him to be holy, he must have been a pretty good guy. So, you can kind of understand it from two different perspectives. But nevertheless, Noah's not amazing. He's not perfect. Matter of fact, he screws up after he gets off the ark. So let's look at Moses. So was Moses that spectacular? Well, he often had fits of anger. He rebuked God 3 times. So God had to argue with him. And there were 3 times where Moses basically said, I don't want this job. I don't want to do it. And I'm not going to get into the whole thing about it. But, Moses says he's a stutterer. Moses says that no one will believe him. And all sorts of other sort of comments with God. And then throughout the Torah portion, Moses and God argue with each other constantly about all kinds of issues. So it wasn't that Moses was necessarily perfect. It's just that he was the right guy for the job. King David is another great example. As a matter of fact, in the narrative on King David, it's actually said that David is out in the field, he's shepherding, and he's not brought in when it's time to choose a new king. So all of his brothers were brought in, and it's asked, why would you even want David? Why would we even bother to bring David in? David's the loser kid. David's the guy who likes to, kid who likes to hang out in the field all day. It's sort of the equivalent of the kid that likes to sit and play Xbox all day. Why would you want that kid to be in the gifted program, let's say, right? So that's kind of the perspective that David starts off with. He's just not that great. The moral of the story, though, is that God chooses people. And sometimes God chooses people that we wouldn't see as perfect, as good enough, as holy enough, because they're the right person at the right time. Now, there's a way of looking at this, Exodus talks about. So God is handing down the commandments, and there's a really particular line. So it's Exodus 24, 6, and 7. The Hebrews respond to God's commandments, we shall do, and we shall learn. So I'm going to repeat that one more time. We shall do, we shall learn. Does anything strike you about that as a little bit strange? We shall do, and we shall learn. Sounds kind of unusual, right? Does anyone have a thought on this? We shall do, we shall learn. So Elisheva makes the comment, action before knowledge. Okay. Any other comments on this? We shall do, we shall learn. I'll give you a hint as to where I'm going with this. There is, unfortunately, a common phrase said about religious people, which is, are you practicing or are you not? So are you a practicing Jew or are you a non-practicing Jew? Are you a practicing Muslim, a practicing Christian? So we got a few comments here. Action before knowledge, and Yoel saying group commitment. Okay, great, perfect. Those are two very important parts of it. One thing about Judaism is this idea of religion as a practice. So you think about what it means to practice something, like practicing piano or practicing to learn a new language or whatever the case is. It's not about learning something and then doing it. It's about doing it and learning it at the same time, and that through the doing, you actually improve your learning. And just like playing piano, you're not going to get it right the first time. You're going to You're going to have to make some mistakes. You're going to have to goof up. You're going to goof up earnestly, honestly, but you will improve. As you continue with your doing, you will learn. So, there's a great line in the Talmud that talks about people converting Judaism. One of the things it says is that you're not supposed to burden a person who converts to Judaism with too many teachings. And so the reason why is that if you set up the precedent, if you set up that hoop that you have to jump through, where you say, okay, there is a certain amount of religious education that you need to have so that you can be Jewish. You need to learn everything that there is to know so that you can be doing Jewish correctly. What the Talmud basically says is that no one could ever convert then, because you have to do Jewish. You have to do mitzvot. The only way you can really do mitzvot in a Jewish context is to be Jewish. So the Talmud says we're not going to burden people with a lot of learning. We're going to let them convert and then have the opportunity to learn and to experience. And that's really what it's about. So that's how religion is a practice, you might say. All right. Now, the great thing about the Torah is that it's open source holiness. So there's nothing in Jewish tradition which you can't look up somewhere. Now, there's this idea that certain people are particularly spiritually elevated. But if you notice, usually it's because they are great scholars. They're great learned people. The only thing that makes them great is that they took the time to learn it. So it's just like being great at anything else. You will be an amazing chef if you spend 10 hours a day cooking. Was it that you were sort of born to be a great chef? No. You cooked for 10 hours a day for 1,000 days straight. And that's how you learned how to cook. And that's how you became a great chef. You absorbed yourself in what culinary art was, and you learned every single little perspective about cooking until all of a sudden you were a 4 Michelin star chef somewhere in Paris, let's say. And so this idea of holiness and Jewish practice and observance works the exact same way. It's just about getting your hands dirty and being willing to do it. So, we all know that we're holy now. Done. Solved. So now we can move on to the next thing, which is, what does holiness require? And so here's kind of some different things that this week's Torah portion talks about. The first thing is you have to see, I've divided it into 3 categories, which is who you are, what you do, and how you do it. So let's talk about who you are. Any questions, anything, before I move on to this part? It seems like everybody's pretty happy and everyone's sort of following everything, but I always want to make sure that people have opportunities. One other thing I wanted to mention was if you'd like to Skype with me after class, I've had people who've asked me if I would Skype with them. You're more than happy to do that. I block out a certain amount of time after a class for Skyping. So if you would like to Skype with me after class, we can do that as well. And you won't be disturbing me. You will have to deal with the fact that I will be eating my beef brisket tacos, but if you can deal with that, we'll be all set. So, all right, let's move on to the next thing. So, who you are. So who you are, there's 2 teachings in this week's Torah portion. The first is seeing the equality of others. Seeing the equality of others. So all of the laws that are in this week's Parsha, in this week's portion, apply to the Hebrews as well as a category of people called the strangers among you. So those are the Ger Toshav. Those are the people who live alongside the Hebrews. So those could have been slaves. They could have been non-Hebrew spouses, non-Hebrew children. They could have been people who left Egypt with the Hebrews. So it could have been Egyptians. It could have been the multicultural children of Egyptian and Hebrew relationships. There's a lot of different ways that you can understand that. It could be the Canaanites, etc., etc. So, but it's important that Akare sets up the perspective that these laws are universal. They apply to everyone. These laws of how to be holy apply to everybody. If you want to dwell within the Jewish experience, within the experience of being part of the Hebrews, then you are equal under the law, and you have a responsibility within the law to provide that. Now, I will make a quick sort of bold statement, which is that I think this is the way we should approach interfaith marriage, as opposed to trying to, force conversion or to try to get people to convert to Judaism. Here is a halakhic, standpoint right here that says the stranger among you follows the same rules. By that perspective, I think non-Jews can light menorahs and observe Shabbat and all of these other things. Excuse me. So that's my own personal thought, unrelated to what we're talking about here, but I felt I should say it. So the next comment here, this is from chapter 17, verse 16. This has to deal with the Yom Kippur service itself. You ask for forgiveness, and you are forgiven. You only bear burdens if you don't take the steps to remove them. When it's over, it's over. And sometimes it doesn't feel that way, Sometimes it feels like when we do something bad to someone and we ask for their forgiveness, even if they say they forgive us, no, you still did wrong. You still have this historical guilt you need to feel. And Judaism says no. When you've asked forgiveness, it's done. It's over. Judaism is trying to set up an ideal, situation here. Trying to set up a precedent that, if you ask God for forgiveness, God forgives you. It's just that simple. I think it's funny when I hear missionaries say, well, God can't forgive you for all of the things that you do, which is why we need the Messiah. It's like, no, if you look at Judaism, we believe that God forgives you. It's an instantaneous thing. When you sincerely ask for forgiveness for things that you have done to another person or to God, because there are sins against God and there are sins against people, and they're seen as two kind of different things, it's instantaneous forgiveness. So that's really the qualities that you need to have. You need to ask forgiveness, and you need to treat people as an equal. That's the kind of who you are perspective. So then there's what you do. So the first part is creating opportunities for others to engage in holiness. So the Cohen Gadol, the priests, that's what they did. We no longer have priests. So it's now your responsibility. So what does that mean? That means leading a service at one shul, giving you a plug. It means teaching a class. It means doing some sort of charitable project where other people are getting involved. So it's not just you being the great person who's giving charity, who's giving tzedakah. It's not about you being so great that you start blogging about social justice issues. It's about, how do I help other people to do holy things? It's about empowering others, and that's really what your goal is. It's not about you doing amazing stuff. It's about you helping others do amazing stuff. And through that process of you helping others, you are doing holy things. You're actually doing holy things through them. So, like, as an example, the priests would offer a sacrifice. It was a sacrifice on behalf of someone else. So it wasn't that the priest was the one receiving the benefit of the sacrifice. He was just acting as a facilitator of the transcendental experience. And that's what you need to do. You need to provide these opportunities. So another part is going the extra step to challenge yourself to enter into the divine. So that's part of what holiness is. Holiness isn't about you do whatever the letter of the law says and you go through the motions and that's it. It's about creating that extra step. In Judaism, we have this idea of fences around the Torah. And what that means is there are certain things that we don't understand. We don't understand why certain laws exist. And we're concerned that if we follow it to the letter of the law, we'll actually be missing the point. So we create these sort of arbitrary extra laws in order to just make it that much harder for us to do something wrong. That's an example of making that extra step. You know, some other types of extra steps. There is a animal shelter down the street and they're about to lose all their funding. They ask you for $10. You give them $20. When they ask for $20, you give them $40. When they ask you to volunteer for an hour, you volunteer for a day. It's all about adding that little extra. And I'll tell you something really interesting. Sort of looking at it from a nonprofit perspective and an organizational perspective. There's this thing called the 80-20 rule. And it's this idea that 80% of your success, whether it's in a business or a nonprofit or a political campaign or any kind of endeavor, 80% of your success is going to come from 20% of your work. So another way of thinking about that is 80% of your money comes from 20% of your customers, or 80% of your sales come from selling 20% of your product line, let's say. So that's an example of this idea of going the extra step, that there are certain things that they have almost this like magical quality, that they're just, it's a home run. And that's what you need to do. You need to have these sort of home runs. The next part, and this is a part that is tough for people, don't act the way that evil people act. So in chapter 18 of this Torah portion, it's specifically talking about the Canaanites and the Egyptians. So one thing that's tricky for people is they see chapter 18 and they see one particular part of it which talks about male sex. And all of a sudden that becomes this thing about, well, the Torah is anti-gay and all these other things. None of that is true. There are plenty of books that dispute that. Here's what it actually is saying. You shall not defile yourselves by any of these things, for the nations, so this is the trick, for the nations who I am sending away before you have defiled themselves with all these things. So it's about not being like that other person who is doing these terrible things. And by the way, this includes child sacrifice, and it includes using God's name profanely. Okay? So it's not about this one particular thing that sort of people get politically hung up on. What it's really about is you don't want to mimic the behaviors of people who are around you who are not able to relate to the type of holiness that you are trying to ascribe to. So this could be anything. This could be, if you have friends who are gossipy, don't be like them. Don't be gossipy. If you are constantly around someone, let's say, who is negative, don't be negative. It's the same kind of idea. Don't allow the surrounding world to prevent you from doing what you need to do. Another way of looking at it is don't emulate others whose negative qualities you don't want to have. Now that's a tough thing, right? I mean, we live in a world where so many crummy things happen all the time, and we get into this kind of dog-eat-dog way of looking at life. One of the most liberating things for me, and one of the ways that I'm kind of able to deal with this, is by realizing that at the end of the day, if I decide to be a crummy person, if I decide to be just a jerk and just get whatever I want all the time and these other things, at the end of the day, I'm still not going to get everything that I want. If I choose to be a good person, I probably have the same, maybe slightly less luck getting all the things that I want, but I'm going to have more people in my life that care about me. And I'm going to have more positive things in my life. Some people might say that this is kind of like, the compassion gene. It's the gene that makes us go beyond ourselves because we realize that tribal unity and getting along with others is actually quite important. So whether you take that very naturalist perspective or you look at it as a religious moral issue, the important thing to remember is we need to go beyond our surroundings and that this is possible. God sent the Hebrews into a land where apparently things were happening that God does not condone. These ritual sacrifices, these ritual sexual activities, the profaning of God's name, etc., etc. If God wanted these people to be separate, like living somewhere else, God would have sent them to like New Jersey or something like that. Like God would have sent them somewhere that's not in the midst of the Egyptians and the Canaanites, right? The people you're not supposed to emulate. So you may be somewhere that you just need to be, but that doesn't mean you have to take on whatever these negative traits are. You're strong enough because God has put you there. So that's everything for what you do. The last part is how you do it. Give God a small part of everything you do. And, so this is the example of the meat sacrifice. So a portion of the meat that was sacrificed would be given to the Cohen. It was sort of like an income tax, if you will. And what it actually says in the Torah is that it's if you are not doing this, it is as if you have killed another. Now that's a pretty big extreme, right? To say if you don't give, it's like you've killed another, but perhaps you have. Perhaps that small act that you would have done but chose not to do is actually going to kill someone. Here's an example. You go to a 7-Eleven and you see one of those little sort of charity boxes, give a quarter for cystic fibrosis or whatever the case is. Who knows whether or not that coin, that 25 cents that you drop in that box, ends up being part of the money that's used to cure cystic fibrosis or pediatric cancer or AIDS or some other horrible thing. You have no way of knowing if that little amount of time that you gave or that little amount of money that you gave ended up doing some huge thing. You think about scientific discoveries that we have, medical discoveries. They don't just happen suddenly, it's a gradual build. So when you take part in that, even in a very small way, you get the credit for it. You get the credit for that, dollar that you put in that box, or that, email that you forwarded to someone to try to get them to do something. Whatever it is, you are getting that credit for that. It's important that you recognize that small act could be part of a much bigger picture. The last part about holiness, because we've talked so much about all this doing, you need to do all this stuff, is actually rest. So it's actually commanded many, many times in the Torah that we rest. It's the Shabbat rest, the Saturday rest. Shabbat is a gift to God, from God to people, which we then in return pay back to God by observing. So what's happened now? We're all the way back full circle again, right? So we've done all this holy stuff 6 days a week. Now we have the seventh day. Does that mean that the cycle of holiness stops? No. It keeps going, right? Because we haven't stopped being holy. We just stopped working. But by stopping working, we're actually becoming holier, because now we can recharge our batteries for the other 6 days a week when we're doing all this holy, godly stuff. So, the last part, after you've gone the extra step and you've done all these holy things, is to chill out and to relax. All right, so are there any questions? Does anyone want to make any comments? I have a few other things I want to talk about real quick, but I'll give anyone a chance to ask questions. And as I mentioned before, if you would like to Skype with me, go on ahead and tell me now. What I'll do is after this, I'm going to eat, and then we can Skype. But if anyone has any questions, anything they want clarification on, otherwise I will I'll move forward here with my last few comments I need to make. Okay. Well, it seems like there's no questions. So a few more things to say. Don't leave yet. Got a few more things I got to say. So the first thing is, it costs $100 a month to run one shul. $100 a month. No one ever has to pay to use any of our resources. We have a free Siddur, we have free classes, we have free prayer services. I Skype with people, I answer your questions. All of these other things. $1,200 a year. 1200.00. That's what it costs a year. $100 a month. If everyone gave $10 tonight, we would be able to pay for an entire month right now. So if you've enjoyed this event, and I hope that you have, and I hope that you've learned a lot, I hope you'll click the donate button that's up at the top there. You can donate through PayPal. It's totally safe. There's no, you have to worry about, people stealing your identity or anything like that. You can use a credit card, you can use debit card, you can use your PayPal account. You don't need to worry about safety. It's secure, I promise. You can also send me an email, again, patrick@punktorah.org. And I'll answer any questions that you have. I'd love everyone in here to volunteer. You can volunteer to teach a class, lead a service, to do web design, to design graphics. We need graphics help. We need writers for Punk Torah. We need podcasters. We need people to make videos. We need fundraisers. We need people to manage social media. We always need help. It's very, very, very important. To get people's help. We are an online community that requires volunteers, so really appreciate your help here. And let's see, what else have we got going on? We have got, I believe, a Shabbat service this weekend. Let me look real quick. Okay, yes, so we have a Shabbat service, 7 p.m. Eastern. It's being led by the Jones family. Their Shabbat services are fantastic. So 7 p.m. Eastern, right here on One Shul. So that's everything I have for you. I hope that you have enjoyed this class. I will see you Friday for Shabbat services, 7 p.m. Eastern. Oh, no, Lisa actually corrected me. That's right. Yeah, actually, Katsira is doing Shabbat services. You're right. Sorry, I goofed up. Yeah, Katsira is doing Shabbat services. The Joneses did it last week. So yeah, Katsira is this week. There was some question as to whether or not she was going to be able to because she's at a conference, but she is. So yeah, Katsira this weekend. Okay, anyway. So, regardless, Shabbat this Friday, 7 p.m. All right, great. If you want to... go on ahead and let me know if you need to Skype or have any questions. I'm going to go on ahead and sign out. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Take care.